Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvi Navaditamastu Mavid Vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So in this session, I wanted to share some further thoughts with you about the nature of Kundalini. I want to sort of just pick up more or less where we left off last time. And last time we were talking about the relevance of the myth of Kundalini to us all as not only as yoga practitioners, but simply as human beings. The basic thrust of the talk I gave last was that the myth of Kundalini, and by that I just mean the sort of symbol of Kundalini and the idea that that symbol represents some kind of creative energy that, somehow rises through the hollow center of the body, undoes various psychical knots or entanglements that represent our mental conditioning, and ultimately leads us through a progression of insights. That myth, that idea, symbolizes something that we can't turn our backs on unless we turn our backs on ourselves. Once we realize that what it symbolizes is an archetypal movement of creative force that is shaping all of our bodies and minds from within, and that is inviting us to admire its movement, and through that admiration to participate more fully in this, let's say, the self-contemplation of reality. Okay, so I want to say more about the self-contemplation of reality in this talk, what that means. We were getting into it right at the end of our talk last time, but I hope that when we left off, that it was clear that insofar as the myth of Kundalini represents this archetypal process of development, that it has everything to do with us, regardless of if we're headed toward sainthood or enlightenment, whatever exactly that might mean in this lifetime. Okay? So indeed, I think that we can fruitfully contemplate the nature of what that myth describes without having to speculate too much on exactly what the final end of the process of Kundalini awakening might be, if there even is such an end to that process. Okay? And I suggested that at least from the mythology of Hatha Yoga, there's a reason to think that there isn't such an end to that process, or at least that having a conception of what that end is not at all instrumental to fuller participation in the process itself at any particular juncture. Okay. Now, I was telling you a story last time, right? Just a little bit of the mythology of Shiva and Shakti. And in particular, I was telling you about the moment when Shiva and Sati, who's an incarnation of Shakti, and who is Shiva's sort of fiery, contrarian, kind of gothic first love, okay? She performs a series of devotional rituals in order to draw Shiva toward herself, as I told you last time, and when she finally draws Shiva toward her, she does so by encountering a shivling, which is a sort of fundamental sign of Shiva, in a particular clearing, in a glade, and then she sits down in front of that shivling, in front of that sort of monument, that sign, that symbol of Shiva, and she experiences an instance of Kundalini awakening, let's call it. But what happens is that she sits down and she feels her creative energy rising from the altar of the pelvis, right, moving through the center of the heart, and then coming into the cranial vault, at which point she has an insight about the nature of her beloved. She realizes that he's been with her always, because that he just is the space of consciousness in which her entire process of longing for Shiva and seeking Shiva, and indeed the whole process of her natural development up to that particular point in her incarnation, has been happening within that space. And so she's never actually been estranged from her beloved. She's been swimming in him the whole time. So she has this sort of non-dual insight about her connection to her lover. And then finally, Shiva appears, right? Now, I told you also that the form of the shivling, the form of the Shiva lingam, the form of the sign of Shiva, right, represents the interfusion of the masculine and feminine principles, right? Now, on the face of it, when colonizers, from Britain went to India and encountered these various religions that were rooted in a much older tantric tradition, they found these Shiva lingams everywhere in temples and so forth. And they thought that what they were encountering was a sort of symbol of human sexuality, and they interpreted Indian religion then as having a preoccupation with sexuality. They thought that their religion ultimately amounted to just sort of, sex cults, right? If for no other reason than that they saw in the Shiva lingam a representation of, what they thought was a symbol of the male and female regenerative organs, right? But I also told you that that when Sati sat down before the Shiva lingam, her energy rose in empathetic response to the form of the shivling itself, right? So in other words, her prana took shape within her body in such a way that the shape perfectly mirrored or reflected the basic shape of the shivling, right? And so that reminds us that whatever else the shivling might be, right, it can be interpreted as a sign for the rising of Kundalini, right? The sort of bursting forth of the creative principle from a certain sort of dimensionless point. Okay? And indeed, that sign can itself play the role of a dhyana shloka, of a support for meditation, right? And the way that a dhyana shloka works is that not only do you bring the image that the shloka describes. Now, you might have heard of a dhyana shloka in terms of like referring to a particular Sanskrit verse, right? Like something that you chant, right? And indeed, various verses can be dhyana shlokas, but really the shloka is the image. The support is the image that the verse conveys, right? And so murtis, or sort of statues, figures, can also play the same role. And in this case, in all cases, the way that you properly meditate on a dhyana shloka is not by simply bringing before the eye of the mind the image that it describes, but rather installing it in your proprioceptive awareness, right? So you contemplate the image so intensely that your prana starts to hold the same shape, so that you feel as if you've sort of become in some way, or you've become a vessel a mirror for the reflected image of the dhyana shloka, even a channel for the particular energetic form that the shloka describes, right? And in the tantric world, you have this idea that you can't properly meditate on any pranic or deity form until you've installed it in your proprioceptive awareness, because only then can you really bathe that image in your consciousness. Okay. Bathe it in the way that Sati realized that she's been bathed in the consciousness of Shiva, right? That she's sort of swimming in him, she's immersed in him, right? That if he has any form, it's the particular form that she's been taking the whole time. Or that it's the form that's cast by the shadow or of the negative space of the form that she occupies, is where she sees and feels Shiva most intensely. So indeed, when she sits down in front of this form, she installs it in her proprioceptive awareness somehow, or her prana rises in empathetic response, to this image of the Shiva lingam, to this Shiva lingam that's before her in the clearing. Right? And it's precisely through that empathetic response that her Kundalini awakens and arises and brings her to this particular insight about the nature of Shiva. Okay? Now, one thing that we're reminded of in this myth, right, up till this point, but also going further, that the myth is based around an erotic metaphor. Okay. When Kundalini awakens and Kundalini begins to ascend through the hollow center of the body, she's driven by desire, right? Her animating force is her desire to unite with her beloved, and her beloved is Shiva, right? So Kundalini just is Shakti, and Shiva is her destination. Shiva is what she's reaching for, right? And she's longing to, and he's said to sort of abide in the cranial vault, right? He abides in the head, right? So particularly at Agnya Chakra, this is where Kundalini has to ascend through the body, according to the myth, in order for her to unite with her beloved. So that moment in the story that we considered, that we're considering again now, when Sati finally has an insight about Shiva, and then Shiva finally appears to her, is the moment when Kundalini reaches the Agnya Chakra, and the moment when the Kundalini sort of pierces through the delusion of separation from the object of love. And it's the piercing through of that delusion. So in other words, it's which Sati experiences as the realization that she's never actually been estranged from her beloved, that brings her into a state of intimacy, of fuller intimacy with Shiva. And it's said further, just in case you're not convinced that the metaphor is thoroughly erotic, that what happens after Kundalini pierces through Shiva Granthi at the Agnya Chakra is that he releases his cool lunar nectar, and a sort of white rain comes down through the body and floods the body with delight. This is the traditional description of the process of Hatha Yoga. Now, in the story of Shiva and Sati, what happens after this moment of reunion is that Sati goes on the back of Shiva's white bull up the mountain to his mountaintop abode, his little cave ashram, and they make love for 25 years, it's said. Right? And again, it's not just sort of solar years that we're talking about, right? Which is already kind of incomprehensible, right? Like 25 hours would have been legendary, right? 25 days is hard to wrap your head around. 25 years is nearly absurd. But these aren't even solar years, these are divine years. And so we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, right? And the idea is that when they are erotically entangled in that way, the worlds go back into balance. So all of the other gods rejoice, right? Because the balance between the devas and the asuras naturally sort of comes back. The sort of natural balance sort of restores itself when they're together. There's a lot to talk about there. Maybe we'll talk about it during this session. If not, maybe we'll talk about it in the next, but let's see. But one question to ask yourself, and a question that I wanted us to think about together, is why the erotic metaphor, right? Because indeed, if you listen to the story and you look at the myth, it comes through so clearly, right? That there's this erotic metaphor, and of course, as the erotic dimension of the Shivling, and indeed of the various ceremonial rites that are commonly performed with the Shivling, particularly those most common rites which involve pouring milk over the top of the Shiva lingam so that it sort of rains down the monolithic part, right? Carry an obvious kind of erotic charge, right? But this fact is often and has been obscured by a sort of more puritanical culture, which has been interested in sort of adapting or appropriating this myth, to its own ends. So in other words, the erotic dimension of it has often been obscured or downplayed or sort of explained away as if it wasn't absolutely central to the meaning of Kundalini. And so I want to explain why it should be seen as central, and then we can talk further about sort of what that means for our way of relating to it and what that means for yoga practice. Okay. So I want to just, in order to do that, I want to sort of step back in conceptual space just a little bit to remind you of more generally what Shiva and Shakti represent, okay? And what the basic dynamic is between them. Okay? There are sort of different ways of making this out, right? But the way that is richest to me and really sort of comes alive in my imagination is as follows, that Shiva and Shakti are two dimensions of a single profundity of consciousness, right? And Shakti, as the sort of, let's say, the feminine principle, represents the creative aspect of that profundity. So she is the creative potential implicit in that profundity. Shiva, as the masculine principle, is the sentience of that profundity. He's the awareness of it, right? And so he's the space of consciousness within which Shakti unfolds her creative power. Now, in the story that I told you about Shiva and Sati, when Sati takes that particular incarnation, when the goddess incarnates as Sati, she does so at the request of Indra and other gods who've been tyrannized by their demonic cousins, while Shiva's been meditating alone up in the mountains, away from the goddess. So when Shiva goes off and meditates in the mountains, he goes alone, or he goes with his ganas, actually, which is also super interesting. Maybe we'll talk about them. But he goes off and into the mountains alone without, and so he's not involved with the goddess, which means he's not involved with the creative aspect of reality. And when that happens, he kind of succumbs to his own centripetal force. He succumbs to his own inward moving, sort of indeed deeply aponic, space-clearing, contractive energy, right? And so basically he becomes self-enclosed. And self-enclosure is traditionally understood to be the dysfunction of the masculine principle. Okay? And perhaps not only traditionally. And the self-enclosure of the masculine principle is catalyzed by the separation between the feminine and the masculine, okay? And I just want to say, in case some of you may be cringing as I talk about feminine and masculine, because those are such charged terms these days. I feel myself sort of spasming as I say those words too. But please understand, I know there's a lot more to talk about here, but please understand that it's understood in this tradition that every single one of us, indeed every single being, is a conjoining, right? An admixture of the masculine and the feminine, and that the process of yoga is about bringing together, connecting with, and conjoining the masculine and feminine principles within each of us individually, okay? And so if you think of it that way, then if anything that's said about the traditional way of understanding things sort of offends your views about gender politics, then just remember that the understanding is that these principles are within us all, and that there's a certain sense in which the yoga is inviting us to connect with both of those principles and hold them in balance within ourselves, right? And that fundamentally, what these principles represent are our creative fecundity and potentiality on the one hand, and our potential for deeper awareness on the other hand. And, at least in this sort of non-dual way of understanding these things, those two dimensions of our nature are said to be fundamentally inseparable from one another. So they don't stand in any kind of hierarchical relationship, right? And in fact, each of them needs the other in order to expand, in order to manifest its fuller potential. And the dysfunction of each materializes precisely when these two principles are not supporting one another. Okay? So that you might be wondering, because I didn't say it, what's the feminine dysfunction traditionally? Well, it's a kind of self-forgetting. It's being pulled out of oneself, right, into externalities, so much that one forgets who one is. Okay? Sati can't remember who she is except when she's allowed to unfold her creative potential into the space of Shiva, into the space of consciousness. Okay. She learns who she is. She begins to answer the primitive existential question, who am I, precisely by unfolding her creative potential. Okay. So, at the beginning of this particular story, Shiva had gone off to meditate alone, and he'd been meditating for thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, and so the things had gone out of whack in Devaloka. The demonic cousins of the Devas had come to tyrannize the Devas, and they'd thrown Indra out of his palace and sort of taken over, and the gods were, of course, very, very upset about this, so they went to ask, they went with Vishnu to ask the goddess if she would incarnate into their realm, into the realm where Shiva had been meditating, to draw him out of his meditative stupor. In other words, to pull him out of his condition of self-enclosure, back into creative involvement with the world. Because whenever Shiva comes into creative involvement with Shakti, things just naturally go back into balance, right? How does that work? What is that all about, right? We'll come to that, I think. But here's the thing, is that when they ask her if she would do this thing, if she would incarnate and pull Shiva out of his meditative stupor, she delightfully agrees, because this is what she's into. And this happens time and time again in the mythology of Shiva and Shakti, that Shiva goes off to meditate alone, the world goes out of balance, and then she has to pull him out, right? The world has to, circumstances have to, the movement of life has to pull consciousness out of its self-enclosure, precisely so that it can find space to spread itself out more fully and more fully reveal what it is, okay? Now here's the thing, is that she agrees to do this because this is most fundamentally what she's into. The goddess is most fundamentally into revealing her sensuous aspect to the light of consciousness. Right? To put it another way that's maybe a little provocative, the fundamental desire of the creative or feminine principle is to express herself into the space of a witnessing, adoring awareness. What she wants fundamentally is to be seen, to be heard, to be touched, to be tasted, to be smelled, to be contemplated in her movements, right? And so to have a sharp, lucid, adoring, intimately involved witness to her creative unfolding. Right? And that's why she always agrees to incarnate into the realm where Shiva's meditating and to pull him out. Okay? Now this is a super important idea, right? Because it means in the first place that if Shakti's animating principle, most fundamentally, is her desire to reveal her sensuous aspect to the light of consciousness, right? And to be perceived in that way, by that adoring awareness, right? It means that there's an erotic principle at the very heart of reality. Do you see what I mean? Okay. Now, in saying that there's an erotic principle at the heart of reality, what this doesn't mean, you might think, right? And when you say that, it means, well, there's some kind, that there's some kind of particular experience, that that something or someone is trying to get, right? And that's what sort of, what can sound cheap about seeing the universe in that way is that it almost implies, right, that the world is unfolding for the sake of some particular thrill, right? But that's not the meaning of it at all, right? And I'll tell you why. Okay, so in the first place, just going back to the mythology of Shiva and Shakti, when Shiva and Shakti make love, they make love for extraordinarily long amounts of time, right? And there's never a moment of peak experience or, worse, of sort of fluid discharge that brings their erotic exploration to an end. That never happens in the mythology of Shiva and Shakti. Although they do indeed have children together, they don't have children by ordinary biological means, okay? They do it according to, extraordinarily advanced reproductive technologies. Yeah. I mean, Ganesh, for example, is basically born from a few dead skin cells that come off of Sati's arm, and then she kind of chants into it. Murugan, or Skanda, who's Ganesh's brother, comes, he comes into the world without any egg from Sati or anyone at all. He just sort of springs from Shiva's sperm, which Shiva let with his back turned to the goddess, simply because Vishnu was begging for it. And the meaning of this, at first, when I first was learning these myths and reading every version that I could get, I would always see that in every single version, the storyteller is always and then Shiva and Shakti made love for 25 celestial years, And I thought okay, fair enough. That's a super juicy part. Of course, you're going to put that in your version of the story. Keep it juicy, right? Sells stories, right? But then when I realized that they never have children in the conventional way, and indeed Shiva never spills his seed in the presence of the goddess, or at least not facing her, and never because of her, right? And never thinking about her, right? And the point of that is this. The point of that is that there's no peak experience or end state to the process of yoga, no peak experience that brings the process of yoga, at least understood in these tantric terms, to its final conclusion. Okay? The erotic entanglement of Shiva and Shakti is an endless exploration, right, of the sensuous aspect of consciousness, right? It's an endless exploration of what it's like for bodies to touch one another, to smell one another, to see one another, right? And it's the fundamental metaphor for the profundity contemplating its own sensuous aspect, right? The profundity of consciousness, asking itself the question, or a certain, let's say, a certain part of the profundity of consciousness asks itself the question, who am I? And then it starts creating the world in response. And indeed, the part that asks the question and the part that answers is both Shakti, right? So Shakti goes before Shiva, who, according to a traditional metaphor, is like her mirror, right? And she says, who am I? But she has to say that in the space of consciousness for it to be a question that's heard, right? For that question to be a live question, it has to be, consciousness has to receive it somehow, right? She has to hear the question resounding through the space of consciousness. So she says to Shiva, who am I, right? And then she starts creating the world in response, right? And as she's creating, it's like she's just standing before a mirror. She's standing before Shiva, right? And she's turning, and she's looking over her shoulder to see how she looks in the mirror. And every time she turns, she's wearing a new gown. Every time she turns, she's revealing a new aspect of herself. Every time she turns, she's showing something that's never been shown before, and something that will never be shown again, right? She brings a specific world or a specific being or a specific experience to fruition, right? And the uniqueness, the singularity of every single experience, right, is something that we miss when we become too self-enclosed, right? Patanjali's keen on this. Patanjali talks about the way that the imposition of concepts onto an experience distorts or obstructs the singularity of what's appearing, the uniqueness of what's appearing, the fact that what's appearing is, in some dimension, utterly incomparable to any other that has ever been or ever will be, right? Because when we when we name an experience, impose some conceptual structure on it, right, then what we're drawing into the foreground is what that experience shares with certain other experiences that we have a name for, right? And that suppresses or obstructs or in some way occludes the dimensions of the experience that are utterly unique, right? Now, what is it to, for example, to appreciate, to see another person as being a person of a certain kind, rather than as standing forth in their singularity, right? And of course, in actual practice, it's sometimes both, right? That you can do both. But imagine, what it's like, or remind yourself what it's like to see people, to see another person, just in terms of their social status, or their economic status, right? Or in terms of what they can do, or in terms of like some stupid hierarchical relation in which you stand to them, right? And to see them simply in that way is not to see them at all, right? It's not to relate to them, right? Which is why, for example, people who are like celebrities or, heads of state, people who are like super famous can feel so hopelessly isolated and lonely and alone, right? Because people see them in terms of a particular projected image rather than seeing them as they are. Now, when on the other hand, we know that to engage another person in the mode of intimacy, like to be there, to be fully present with another, to be intimately and deeply present with another, like with someone that you love specifically, right, is to see them not in terms of, the various roles that you play in respect to each other, right? Or the various kind of hierarchical relationships that you might stand in respect to them, right? But to simply allow them to sort of stand forth in their particularity. To relate to another person in that mode of intimacy, you have to set aside all of your preconceptions and your ideas about propriety and about what's supposed to happen and about who owes who what, right? So that you can just actually and immediately and directly relate, right? And so it is with yoga. As the opening of the space of consciousness to the immediate and actual unfolding of the creative principle. It's said that Shiva, because he lacks any self-reference point, Shiva, because he has no creation story, Shiva, because he has nothing to protect and nothing to lose. He doesn't recoil from the darker sides of Shakti when she reveals those sides to him. He doesn't protest when she shows her viciousness. He doesn't grasp at her when she shows her brilliance. Right? He doesn't get jealous at her when she shows her intelligence, right? He simply adores all of the various dimensions of herself that she reveals as she turns in front of that mirror with perfect openness and a kind of selfless, but nonetheless deeply involved warmth and adoration. Because that's what the fundamental consciousness does. That's the way in which consciousness as such, not our personal consciousness, right, but the consciousness of which our personal consciousness is a reflection, simply holds space for all of the deeper aspects of our being without brooking any resistance to those whatsoever. And because it does, the creative principle continues to unfold itself in that space. Right? Now, in the microcosm of the mind, things are different. Because we brook all kinds of resistance to the parts of ourselves that don't cohere with our ideas about who we are and what it's acceptable for us to do and to think and to feel, right? And what we can experience and what we can't experience, right? And so we find ourselves dividing the different parts of our consciousness to try and make a kind of small coherent space within which we can live. Now, I want to illustrate this point a little bit further about the self-contemplation of nature by telling you another quick story, okay? So there's a story about how the wisdom of yoga comes into the world, okay? And in this story, the serpent, Anantashesha, is slithering through a glade and comes into a clearing and hears, to his great delight, Shakti asking Shiva to recount to her the secrets of yoga. And Anantashesha is just thrilled. And so he coils up and hides in the grass and listens very closely as Shiva proceeds to tell Shakti all about the promises and tribulations and processes of yoga. And when Shiva finally finishes, Anantashesha tries to slither off, and Shiva plucks him out of the grass and holds him up to his face and tells him that he owes tuition for all the intuition that he's just received. And his tuition is that he has to incarnate into the human realm and share what he's learned with humanity. Okay? So arrangements are made, and Anantashesha appears in the womb of a human yogini named Ganaka. And on the day of his birth, she goes into labor, and he gets his head in the birth canal and goes sliding through the dark tunnel toward the light. And he slips out, and she reaches down and catches him, expecting reasonably to find, that she's had a human baby, but finds instead this being who's human only from the waist to the crown of the head. And he has this slithering, squirming serpent's tail from the waist down, and who has a serpent's hood, which is itself made up of 1,000 other serpent's hoods. Not that she's counting, but she screams, naturally, and throws this being from her hands, and he falls to the ground and salutes his mother, and then slithers off and writes the Yoga Sutras. Okay? And it's a story also about how Patanjali gets his name. Okay? Because Patanjali Pat means to fall, right? And Anjali can mean hands, or a certain gesture of the hands. And so it means fallen from the hands. Yeah. But there are at least two things about this story that I want to draw your attention to, which I think are quite brilliant. And one of them is that as Anantashesha knows, Shakti already knows everything that Shiva could possibly tell her about the nature of yoga, because she is the intelligence behind the yogic process. She's the animating force behind all yogic practice, right? So when she stands before Shiva and asks Shiva to explain to her the secrets of yoga, she's basically standing before him and saying, tell me what you see. Right? She's the embodiment of that intelligence. So she's standing before that mirror again and kind of going, how do I look? Baiting him, How do you like my yoga, she's saying. And he's dumb enough to answer. But in fact, she is also his power of speech, as Anantashesha knows. So when he answers, it's actually Shakti answering herself, answering her question, how do I look? Or, which is just kind of an instantiation, a particular sort of coinage of the deeper existential question, who am I? Right? And when Shiva's replying, it's actually Shakti replying through him, using his mouth, right? And then she's listening, right? So she's listening. It's like her own intelligence is coming back to her, and she's going, like again, checking herself out in the mirror, right? Because she's the part of the profundity, and so, according to the sort of principle that your being is a sort of microcosm of this profundity and contains the same basic dynamics within it, right? There's a part of you that asks the question, who am I? And then starts creating your personality in response, right? And that indeed starts to have all kinds of creative impulses, and then is animated to express those creative impulses in the world, right? Animated to come to expression. And that's your sort of soulful part, right? That's your mind part, your karma part, that needs to reveal its sensuous aspect, needs to express itself into the space of an adoring, witnessing, compassionate awareness that's capable of receiving it, right? That is a fundamental need, according to this mythology, of every human being, right? That your need is a reflection of the need of Shakti to reveal her sensuous aspect to the light of Shiva's adoring consciousness. Then fundamentally your animating principle is the same, right? To reveal your sensuous aspect, and so to reveal the aspects of yourself that are, and because what's revealed through that is going to be, in a certain precious way, fundamentally singular and unique and irreplaceable and irrepeatable, right? And what's the mode of consciousness that understands and appreciates what's irreplaceable and singular and unique in another being? Well, it's love, right? It's in the mode of loving another person that you appreciate and understand, that really grasp, right, the singularity of the other. And this is something that Shiva's doing all along, right? Now, another thing that is really beautiful about this story about how the wisdom of yoga comes into the world is that it suggests that wisdom is not something that you go and learn from a book necessarily. It's not something, even though I said it results in the writing of the Yoga Sutra, right? But so Patanjali goes off and he writes the Yoga Sutra, but where did he get that wisdom? Its primitive source, its sort of primordial source, is not a tradition, not an authority, right? But it came from a process of deep listening to the fundamental elements of being, to the creative principle asking itself the question, who am I? And then creating itself in response, and consciousness witnessing that process without any kind of reactive or any kind of impulsive reaction, without grasping at it, without trying to interfere with it, without trying to manipulate it, without trying to control it, without trying to steer it in any particular direction, without trying to extract any particular experience from it, but simply holding space for it to completely unfold. And then that kind of consciousness, which is the consciousness of love, so the consciousness of eros, once it's been released from its particular object, from the particular thing that it's reaching for, when it stops reaching for anything at all, and the energy of adoration simply pervades the space of consciousness, right? That's compassion. That's the selfless love of eros being liberated, right? And this is what the erotic principle is ultimately reaching for in the course of a human life. Because according to this myth, human life itself, with all of its various activities, with all of your various sort of artistic, intellectual, and spiritual preoccupations, just is part of a process of consciousness contemplating its own fecundity, right? Contemplating the question of who it is by revealing its sensuous aspects and beholding those, right? Now, another thing about this idea of self-contemplation is that it never comes to an end, as I said about the love-making of Shiva and Shakti. Self-contemplation never comes to an end if the object, the self that's being contemplated, is not just the pure light of awareness that Shiva represents, right? But soulfulness, right? Like your karmic situation, your impulses, the whole sort of natural unfolding of your mind in its social and historical context, that doesn't come to an end because the creative energy that's behind it is itself endless. It's always in the process of revealing itself to be other than it just was. It has that kind of infinite depth. And so that means that when the question is asked, who am I? And then consciousness starts creating itself in response, it never creates anything that's definitive. Okay? Shakti never reveals any part of herself that finally brings Shiva's interest in who she is to a close. He never goes, now I got you. Now I know what you are. Finally, I've seen that side of you. Now I get it, right? Because she's always like, watch this. Bet you've never seen this before, right? She's always, right? She has that kind of infinite depth, right? And so that means that the self-contemplation that, of reality that yoga is, and so that spirituality is according to this idea, is not something that you can ever possess. It's never something that you can fully take hold of. It's not something that any particular tradition can ever definitively describe, right? It's something that runs through all traditions, all spiritual modalities, right? Even all modalities that are outside of spirituality, because it runs through every human activity. It runs through every corner and is hidden under every leaf and on every breeze in the natural world. There's nothing that's outside of it. It doesn't exclude anything, and it's always revealing itself with a freshness. It's always revealing something that's utterly new, something that's young, something that has just appeared, just arrived, something that is always full of new possibility. It's always revealing itself in that way, and it's precisely because Shiva understands that he just keeps holding space for Shakti to keep revealing new parts of herself. And that holding of space, right, and the contemplation, that ongoing, endless contemplation of reality that he has for her, right, is what we're trying to align ourselves with and participate in the process of yoga. Okay? And indeed, I wanted to say this too. I know that we're just about out of time, but I wanted to add this very important. I was telling you last time about the way that the spine itself has the form I was telling you about how very early on in your embryological development, this seam forms on the interface between the amnion and the yolk sac, and it forms in linear fashion. Before any other pieces of your body form, a seam of soft tissue is created. And it forms in linear fashion, meaning from a particular point, boom, to another point, and then it thickens back down, right? That would happen. And then when it thickens back down, it's called the notochord. And the notochord is like a flexible rod of tissue that provides the basic structure of the body, of the developing embryo. And so all of these organs and tissues and nerves start to kind of appear and reorganize themselves around this central axis. And so I was telling you about that because I was telling you that the movement of Kundalini actually retraces the line of the notochord, or of what's also called in embryology the primitive streak, which is the seam of soft tissue that forms before it thickens back down. So the primitive streak is the first seam of soft tissue, and then when it thickens, that's called the notochord, right? And then the notochord eventually breaks into pieces, and those pieces become your intervertebral discs, okay? So the lower terminus of the primitive streak, or indeed of the notochord, is what eventually becomes your pelvic floor, and the upper terminus is what eventually becomes your soft palate, right? And so that movement of Shakti that shapes the primitive streak, right, is the first sort of formative movement of energy that brings your body into this plane, into this realm. And your body keeps reorganizing itself around that central axis for as long as you're alive, right? And so, whatever else the Shiva lingam represents, it's isomorphic not only to the path of Kundalini, because the path of Kundalini is the path of a sort of surging of that same vital force from the pelvis to the crown and back again, right? But also the spine itself takes that same pattern, right? Which means that the spine itself, the pelvis and the spine, are themselves Shiva linga. They are themselves earthly symbols of the interfusion of the masculine and feminine principles. You see what I mean? Not simply because they have the same shape. Not simply because Shakti creates and shapes the spine in her upward ascending movement, right? But because what the Shiva lingam represents is the ascending, aspiring movement of creative energy that organizes all psychological development. The spine itself is a symbol of the erotic longing of Shakti to unite with Shiva, because it's formed by her longing to reveal her sensuous aspect to Shiva's adoring gaze. And what it forms is an instrument of the self-contemplation of the sensuous aspect of consciousness, right? You and me are instruments of that same self-contemplation. Consciousness is contemplating its sensuous aspect through your eyes, through your nose, through your ears, right? With your tongue and your fingertips. Every time, everything you touch, everything that you do is being registered by some deeper consciousness, not necessarily your memory, not the memory that you can access, that your sort of personality can access, but there's a deeper consciousness that's aware of everything that's happening to you, that's aware of all of the cellular processes of your body, right? That's aware of, every story, every true story about yourself that you never told yourself. And it has all of those stories, in its store. And so the idea is that it's contemplating itself through us, right? And so and one of the forms that self-contemplation takes is the creation of these beings, these extraordinary beings that stand upright and lift their gaze above the horizon and start to contemplate their place in the cosmos. Let's start to ask these questions very explicitly. Who am I? And then form these ideas, these wonderful myths about Shiva and Shakti, right? To help tease consciousness into a more expansive state where our individual personal consciousness can align with and unite with that deeper self-contemplation of nature, that deeper self-contemplation of the creative principle. And what ultimately is what the animating principle behind all of that is love, but it's a love that moves through a sensuous exploration. It's love that takes sensuous form. It's not the purified, sort of transcendent, it's not simply the purified, transcendent love of spiritual and philosophical projection and fantasy that has nothing to do with actual human beings, nothing to do with actual impulses and feelings, but the kind of love that says yes to the full reality of the mind with all of its embarrassing incongruities, all of its inconvenient memories, all of its insipid habits and blind spots and delusions, together with all of its brilliance and its creativity and its sense of humor and the wonderful uniqueness and singularity of its expressions. Okay. So in conclusion, the Hatha Yoga that is the yoga of Shiva and Shakti is the yoga of embracing all that's particular and unique and singular and formed and what has history and what has conflict and what's inconvenient, right? And what's real, and embracing it with a loving awareness for no other purpose than to be fully present with it and to love it in a genuine, selfless sense. So thank you for listening. I think I'll stop there. But if anybody wants to ask any questions or anything, I'm happy to give space for that, but you don't have to.
I have a brief question.
Yeah, please.
Or maybe. So you mentioned Patanjali,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously we have the sutras.
Mm-hmm.
And I often feel like the sutras, when reading them, it's really, or maybe it's the translation, but it feels like it's encouraging you to kind of like withdraw from the world.
Yeah.
To not accept everything that's happening, to find some distance.
Yes.
So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that originally the original intent or sort of preoccupation of the Yoga Sutra is a preoccupation that was all over the ancient world at the time that the sutra was written, and that is a preoccupation with escaping from the cycle of rebirth, right? Where, and there are ways of sort of reinterpreting that metaphorically that sort of make it more approachable, right? But, if you sort of take it at face value, the basic sense was that, to live in the realm of embodied form is to necessarily subject oneself to a certain indignity and so to a certain kind of dukkha or bad space, a certain kind of suffering, and that the antidote to that, what is the full disentanglement of consciousness from of Purusha from Prakriti, from the creative matrix. So I think that's right. I mean, it's a fantastic question. There's so much to be said about it, and I don't mean to handle it in a way that's sort of short, but there's a question about how these two ways of looking at yoga fit together, right? And if you read a more sort of contemporary but non-scholarly commentary on the Yoga Sutra from a tantrika, like let's say from Swami Satchidananda, because actually, Swami Satchidananda's interpretation and commentary on the Yoga Sutra is, I'm told, the has sold more. It's more widely read than any other, and it's wonderful, and he's amazing. But it's not so much a scholarly interpretation as a sort of reinterpretation of the Yoga Sutra from the perspective of a tantric consciousness, because he was a tantric adept, right? And so there you get a very different sense of it. If you read that one, it really can seem like the Yoga Sutra is about embracing this world, and so I'm saying, he's not there, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wouldn't suggest for a second that he didn't know, or that he was misreading, or that he's misleading us, or anything like that. But it's part of a sort of long-standing Indian tradition that is really wonderful, of sort of acknowledging all of the various sources of inspiration, for your for a particular philosophical or spiritual outlook, and making it, as best you can, showing the ways in which your perspective is a sort of natural outgrowth of that, or sort of builds on that, right? Rather than kind of diverging from it, right? And that's a wonderful tradition to sort of to give voice to that sort of syncretist spirit, that the spirit that tries to, because indeed in that spirit you see this desire to kind of embrace what already was, right? Rather than rejecting it and throwing it away, sort of embrace what was, but to move it in another direction. So this gives this sense of there being some sort of continuity with the past. Yeah. But I do think that when we look at things from these two perspectives as we are now, it at least appears rightly, as you point out, that there are two very different kind of ideas of what yoga is here. One of them is very much about sort of disentangling from the world, and perhaps even in a certain sense withdrawing from it. And another is a bit more about embracing it, right? Now, I wouldn't for a second want to suggest that if you're more drawn to this spiritual perspective in which the spiritual process is about coming more fully to embrace reality rather than turning away from it, that you should, avoid reading Patanjali or something like that. Not at all, because Patanjali's insights about, the way that we disentangle ourselves from the threads of delusion are incomparable. They're incredible. They're just profoundly insightful and instrumental, essential to the process of sort of tantric yoga as we've described it, because it's only by overcoming sort of eventually breaking through those threads of delusion that the heart sort of finds its natural ability to open wider and wider and wider to the full spread of reality. Yeah. And you know what I think, because I really like that question and there's so much there, and I think what we'll do, because I'm gonna do a third talk about Kundalini, a third sort of continuation of this discussion, And what it occurs to me now that I'd like to do is to talk about this movement of withdrawing from the world and the movement of embracing it, and the kind of interplay between those two movements as it's dramatized in the mythology of Shiva and Shakti. And so in that way, maybe we can like explore this question a little bit further together. Next time. Thank you for asking.
I'm sorry, can I ask, how long does it take to awaken your Kundalini? Does it depend on your karma or any other circumstances?
It's traditionally said to depend on your karma, but the other idea is that, that the way that we've been looking at it here, it's sort of like there is no end state that is the full awakening of Kundalini. Like, we haven't imagined such a state, And I'm not saying that such a state doesn't exist. I'm just saying that pragmatically speaking, right? The use of envisioning what a full awakening of Kundalini is like is itself highly questionable. Right? Because what kind of mischief does the mind perform with such a projection? Right? And
I've heard many scary stories about people who were able to awaken their Kundalini and then many very
Of course. Yeah. But I mean, one of the things that I was trying to communicate in the last talk was that the rousing of Kundalini is not the rousing of a special energy that's different from the energy that just wells up in you in all kinds of, ordinary upheavals of emotion. The upheavals of emotion that cause the various dramas of your personal and spiritual biography, right? And I really mean that. I mean, that's so important to like really internalize that thought, because it means that if you think that Kundalini, if you keep asking yourself like, well, have I had a Kundalini experience? What is it like to have a Kundalini experience? And you imagine that it's something other, because the answer is yes. Life is a Kundalini experience. Everything is a Kundalini experience, right? So like you've had many well, have I had any like real, surging Kundalini experiences? Well, of course you have. Haven't you lost your temper? Haven't you lost your cool? Or, more interestingly, haven't you had some kind of upheaval of thought and emotion and memory that forced you to reorganize your way of seeing yourself and your way of being in the world and relating to other people, right?
many times.
Yeah, of course. And that's what the Kundalini metaphor is all about, right? And it's important because it's only if you really appreciate and like take that to heart that you realize that Hatha Yoga is inviting every single one of us into its full participation. Not saying like, whoa, have you ever experienced this sort of esoteric spiraling energy up your spine? Because if you haven't, you can't be in the club. That's not what it's saying. People will talk that way, I mean, of course, people appropriate these things and sort of use them to sort of set up, different sort of false hierarchies based on various spiritual projections. And of course, Brahmanical culture with its, kind of dark, shadowy political agendas has appropriated these tantric ideas in its various ways to make sure that you understand that there are certain authorities on the question of Kundalini, and if you want to know anything about it or talk about it, you need to consult the authorities and say what they say. Oh, and by the way, there's a big distance between you and them and the reality that you think you're reaching for in Kundalini experience, etc., right? But it's not as if, but can a Kundalini experience, does Kundalini have many, many secrets that are not revealed by these sort of the more sort of ordinary, upheavals of thought, emotion, and memory that we've all experienced in our lives? Well, of course. Why would we think it doesn't, right? Because presumably it is also Kundalini experiences that sort of, transform and elevate, the consciousness of any human being that attains to some kind of, exalted state, right? So anyone that you may admire, for their sort of, for their insight, for the space of consciousness that they embody, right? Anyone that you may admire for that, you can be sure that what allowed their consciousness to transform to that state was Kundalini. So it also has this sort of, extraordinary spiritual potential, this potential for raising consciousness to very lofty heights, right? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But there's no sense in us sort of, comparing ourselves, to those, to whatever ideas that we have about where that leads. What's more fruitful is to feel the desire inside ourselves to expand our consciousness outward, right? From the desire that sort of, our sense of confinement in ordinary consciousness and our sort of longing to expand our being in such a way that we can have greater intimacy with, that is, that we can relate more openly and immediately and directly to the creative forces that are shaping our minds and bodies and our experiences and indeed our relationships and indeed the way that things are unfolding for us in life, that we can relate to those more openly and directly. We have a longing for that. That is the longing of Kundalini, right?
Thank you. It was beautiful.
Yeah, of
Thank
course. Of course. Yeah. Okay, my friends, well, I'll let you all go there. But, just to remind you also that these are kind of prelude talks for the upcoming 30-week philosophy course called Into the Depths, where we basically just do this every Saturday for an hour and a half. And there are also like readings and pre-recorded talks for that. And if you want to talk to somebody about that, want to hear more about that from someone who's not me, you can set up a call with Leela, who was here a minute ago. Are you still around, Leela? I don't see her square now. Maybe she had to drop off the call. But, oh yeah, no, there she is. But anyways, if you want, you can go to the website and set up a call with her if you want, more particular information. And I'll be scheduling the third talk really, really soon. And it'll, I'll do it within the next 2 weeks. That we'll have that talk, and I hope you'll join, and look forward to seeing you. And have a great week.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tai.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.